Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening. Hey everyone, welcome back to Divergent Conversations. This is the last week of our Neurodivergent Entrepreneur series, and we have an awesome guest on to talk about her business journey as a late in life diagnosed autistic ADHDer. She is a really good friend of mine and colleague and well known in the mental health entrepreneurial spaces. Maureen Werrbach, who is a therapist, group practice owner in the Chicago area. She is the founder of the Group Practice Exchange. I personally think one of the most helpful membership sites if you are in the mental health entrepreneurial spaces and thinking about growing your business. She is a speaker, an author, probably more things that I can't think of right now, a leadership coach and strategist, and really happy to have you on. And I know you hate bio, so anything I missed?
No.
Okay, good. Yeah, we were just talking about before we were recording, 3 autistic ADHD people in a room, in a Zoom room. This is going to be an interesting transition segment where we try to figure out who's talking and when. I wanted to have you on specifically because obviously, like, over the last couple of years, I've gotten to know you really well and you've become a really good friend, but your journey is a great one to highlight. And you were diagnosed autistic last year, right?
Yeah, maybe a little over a year ago, something like
Last
that.
So can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about your journey into the neurodivergent space in terms of like, hey, what made me pursue this process? What was the catalyst and like what was happening behind the scenes?
Sure. So I was diagnosed ADHD in college. Um, but like it was a very weird experience because the psychiatrist kind of sort of flippantly was like, yep, but you're a straight A student and you've like never gotten a B in your life. So clearly you're good. And, I was young and didn't realize that that was even something that he was assessing. Um, and so was like, all right, cool. So I did nothing with the information for all of these years and didn't realize that, just because I did well in school, which from the outside perspective looked easy, but from the inside perspective was like if you were in my brain and in my bedroom while I was studying was a very different experience. But if that's all the teacher saw was good grades and a quiet student who had a perfectionism and didn't want to move too much and didn't want to be kind of front and center or seen at all in school, like it was easy to bypass very, very easily. So yeah, that was it until like almost 40. And I met you in person finally. Yeah, and we were speaking at a 𝗿𝗲𝘀𝘁𝗍 conference in, oh my gosh, Maryland. And you and I met up at a bar. And I don't know, I think you and I might have a slightly different story as to how quickly you said this. I felt like it was pretty immediate, like maybe within an hour, where you were like, oh my gosh, you're so autistic, right? And I remember like this sense of relief in a way, because I had maybe for the past year had been looking stuff up, but feeling very much like similar with the ADHD, like I don't present in the stereotypical ways, right? And what I'd known. And I have an older child who's non-binary autistic, and then my younger child is ADHD. But in like kind of observing my eldest child, I was like, they'd been diagnosed since they were very young, but we presented very differently, at least in terms of how they interact in school and all of that kind of stuff. And so I was like, initially never thought about it until they got older. They're a teenager and they're starting to like, I'm starting to see myself in them a lot. And so maybe a year or two ago, maybe 2 years ago, I started looking into it and I was like, I don't know. I don't want to be in a space that I feel like others will probably in the space will judge. I'm also a late in life lesbian. And I remember I was out as bi for a long time and always wouldn't tell people because I was like, the bi stigma in even the queer community. So I kind of felt similarly of like, I'm afraid to even journey in because I'm doing okay, I thought. And so it wasn't until you kind of said it where it almost gave me the permission to allow myself to, be tested and then get that diagnosis. But yeah, it was a fun experience having you say that because I know you bring up like, it's a very testy sort of place to be in to be like, you're autistic to a person. And for me, it was like a welcoming sort of release and, the start of actually doing any sort of work to get that diagnosis.
When we start this podcast, we always do the same thing. Rock back and forth and look at each other like who's going to unmute first. I was just paying attention to that. I love that you say that it offered relief. Like I've talked about this publicly with your story before. Obviously, that is a gamble in any situation to just tell someone that information. I felt safe enough to do that with you, considering we were like friends and we were deep diving a lot of personal stuff that day. So it just felt like the right time. It could have gone off the rails very quickly though, and that could have been received very differently. So I just want to name that for people who are listening. Um, with that being said, when you say relief, I saw I even saw it as you just said it. Like you were just like, and I felt this relief, like viscerally, physically feeling that experience. So can you tell us a little bit about like how that has reframed your perspective, not just in your business, but in your day to day and in your life?
Yeah. I remember that day with you was the first day that um, I realized that I mask a lot. And it's been like a whole journey of like, who is me? Who's the real me? Since then. But I remember it was the first time that, I always uh, was told that I was weird. I didn't have a lot of friends, that whole thing. And so I just chalked it up to like, I'm an only child and, an immigrant and just couldn't connect with the like American stuff when I was younger, and my mom didn't help with that. And I just kind of chalked it up to that. And I remember when I sat with you that day, like you talked a lot about, just eye contact and just liking, kind of sitting parallel and not having to give a lot of eye contact. And I remember being like in that conversation or that whole day of conversations, very like allowed to kind of just be, and didn't realize I'd been performing a lot before then. And so I want to start by saying that to your question of is like, I just had this experience of being like, oh, I can have a conversation. I remember going everywhere from like one point to another. Is probably a mix of my ADHD parts and autistic parts at the time being like very like held by you maybe, like I could just be. And so it was my first experience of just feeling so comfortable in my skin and like allowing myself to explore what could I be, who could I be, that I haven't been allowed to explore. Since then, it shaped a lot of like, I think for my whole life, I've been very sensitive to other people's judgments. And although that's not, completely changed 180, it's definitely getting that diagnosis has helped me be a little bit more kind to myself and kind of be like, I am me. So I know, I'll always probably be weird to some people. And now there's a lot less shame tied to it, where like when I was younger and as a teen in my early 20s, I tried really hard to fit in. And now I'm just like, I'm okay being on the outside a little bit. And there's my few people who understand my quirks and things that are maybe not, average, and they allow it. They allow space for it.
Sounds very similar to like you have some similarities to Megan's story. You've talked a lot about the same things, Megan, growing up and going through college and experiencing life in a lot of similar ways. I know Maureen, as like a immigrant of like a German parent and a military family, there was a lot of rigidity in the home. And I know a lot of it was like chalked up to like, this is why I am the way that I am. And I think it's impressive when we're able to like unmask and just kind of embrace ourselves for the first time. I think it's still a learning process for me, like 3 years into my diagnosis journey and experience. Like I still am trying to figure out who I am. I know, Megan, you've talked about like chat GPTing hobbies before to figure out like, what do I even do that I enjoy? And I think that this is kind of the one of the most, I don't want to say liberating, but freeing experiences once you finally put that lens to your perspective and your experience to kind of like start to make sense of things that haven't made sense for so long and how it impacts you, not only personally, but like because this is an entrepreneurial series too, like it impacts our business decisions. It impacts what we want to do with the information that we have and how we want to apply it. Um, Megan, I know for you, like you've talked about how your special interest turned into your business. Like that's really what happened for you post diagnosis, right? Like I think that happens to a lot of us where all of a sudden you start to see everything through a new lens. And if you can incorporate your special interest as well, it feels like really, really aligned. So, um, Megan, any feelings or thoughts about that for yourself in general?
I had an association, if I can like bring it back to mind, and it's still kind of a half-baked thought, but this idea of kind of all of the narratives we have that explain our weirdness. Yeah, I absolutely relate to that as well, that there's a lot of other explanations for like why I would struggle to truly break into the group. Um, and how those questions pre-discovery for me was from a place of constriction often, of like trying to figure out the equation of like what's wrong with me. And once I discovered I was autistic, it became a slightly different question. It became a more expansive question of like, I am different, and let me lean into that difference and let me see what freedom and liberation comes on the other side of setting aside social constructs. Um, I mean, I think I've always set aside social constructs, but like I've always been clumsy with what society deems normal, but I was trying to fit into it. And then after diagnosis, the way I approach the question around difference, it's from an expansive place, a place of let's lean into this. Let's explore other identities. We've talked about that a lot, like with the intersection of queer identities and neurodivergent identities and gender identities. And so the energy around how I experience my misfitness absolutely shifted once I had a narrative or a lens that made sense of it and gave me freedom to queer. I love the use of queer as an action, as the ability to queer and to break free of a lot of the kind of social constructs that we're trying to fit ourselves into for much of our life. And I think that's what entrepreneurs often are doing. I just heard it in an interview I was listening to yesterday where someone was saying, I think it was a psychiatrist, was saying, a lot of creators are misfits. And that's why they enter this world, is because the traditional school systems, the traditional work systems didn't work for us. And I thought that was such an interesting take on creators. And I was like, yep, that makes sense. That makes sense that a lot of us are misfits.
That does make sense. My something that you just said reminded me of something my therapist told me when I first came out as lesbian 3 or 4 years ago. And she said, like, I don't remember exactly like welcome, but also like you're coming out of this closet and you're going to see how many other closets you can that is possible for you to come out of. Like there's something about coming out of that closet, I guess, where she's like, you start to see how many closets like society has that you don't even realize you might be in. And I'm thinking about that even from like a neurodivergent perspective, because that came afterwards. And I wonder if my own openness to exploring that, because I obviously knew I had the ADHD diagnosis forever and just was like, whatever, that maybe coming out has helped me even be willing to like open other doors and just look in, like, all the little doors that there are to like that society sort of says is not an appropriate door to come out of. Um,
I love that quote from your therapist so much.
yeah.
Once you come out of that closet, what other closets? Yeah, I've had a similar thing I say, kind of like once you start queering one identity, it's contagious, and you start kind of queering all of your identities in the sense of like, how do I embrace freedom? How do I embrace liberation? How do I authentically lean into me? Um, and and so absolutely, I see so much queering that happens of all the identities. And it's interesting. Like it doesn't. I notice some people's access point. Their first one is embracing maybe like a non-binary identity, or maybe it's embracing a sexually queer identity, or maybe it's embracing a neurodivergent identity. But then it's like it so often does lead to these other doors. But it once you do one, it's so much more likely that you can think expansively about other identities. It's such a fun process to watch. I do miss that about therapy. Like that identity process is such an exciting, scary, but also such an exciting, expansive time in people's lives.
I have this visual of like standing in front of a cabinet or a dresser and like pulling these drawers out right now as you were talking about those things, like, and just examining them. But I
Mhm.
think, again, like you both said, being way more open to other identities and then being really curious about exploring them too, and not just like shutting the door and pretending that it doesn't exist or wishing it away, but really trying hard to figure it out and embrace it and accept it too, to have some different perspective on who we are as human beings is so important. So I think it's huge. Focusing back on like you're a leadership coach, you're well known in the industry in terms of how you show up. Megan and I talked about values aligned business with Megan, is it Corey Wilkes? Is that correct?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
A couple episodes ago. How do your values align with your business? Because I know you personally, so I know this is a really important part of everything you do. But I think this is also something we talked about as neurodivergent, especially autistic ADHD people, being really like staunchly invested in our values that we have and aligning our businesses to them.
Yeah. Um, it's interesting that you say that because I don't think I realized until this year the why behind my business values, that they were so connected to like my like social justice. Um, I'm so like almost sometimes when I step outside of myself in a way I don't want to, but like almost from like trying to be neurotypical lens, not purposefully, but like historical, just being used to that, down at myself. I'm like, sometimes you're a little annoying about about your like level of like, right and wrong and uh, you know, justice for, certain peoples and all of this. But I feel like it wasn't until um my diagnosis that I was doing research on, like, that a lot of times that can be tied to being autistic is like having this like sense of like wanting um like rightness for people, and like that those that are not given opportunities like that I need to like step in and like do my own work to like at least make the space around me what I feel like is aligned with my values. So um my businesses are both like led from an anti-oppressive standpoint, and obviously as a white woman, I do a lot of work on my own to see what my impact is as a white woman and as a business owner who employs lots of people, many of whom are BIPOC. And I think I just realized in the past, I don't know, year or so, that like embracing embracing my own values in the business versus like seeing the business as almost like it has its own values. You know what I'm saying? Like I felt like for so long I saw my business, of course, as a separate entity for myself, but almost like that those values just kind of existed there, that I like gave them, but that I didn't realize that they were my own, in some ways. And it wasn't until, probably about a year ago that I was like, well, it makes so much sense why I'm so like heels dug in the ground about certain values that I have, like anti-oppression, and just like feeling like it probably came hand in hand with the realization of my being autistic. I don't know. Does anyone else? Do you guys have that? Like, just real. I don't know. I just visualize like heels dug in the ground about certain things, and for me, one of those is like what I feel like could be almost an annoying amount of like anti-oppression conversations in everything, and like researching it, and then telling people about it, and then being like, "How is this impacting work? How is this?" And like, I know Patrick, you've talked about it, just diving so much into like being autistic and just talking about it a nonstop. And I feel like that's almost like my like little segue is the anti-oppression work.
There's a great article by Tara Vance on Neoclassic. Perhaps you've seen it, but I think the headline is something like autistic people don't have values. We are our values. And this idea of like how integrated our values are to our identity. And with that also our interests. But what you're saying, I actually, I saw a bit back when I was doing assessments. This is one that can be really hard to tease out, is when social justice is a special interest, or especially when it's also tied to an identity. So for example, like queer people who are really into queer theory, because it makes sense to be really passionate about these things. And these are things that like, typically if you're passionate about social justice, it's with some intensity. And so then teasing out, okay, like, but is this a special interest, or is this, but yeah, I absolutely see this often, kind of that justice sensitivity, but then on top of that, where it's also a special interest. And so like the reading about it and the like, yes. So absolutely. I experienced some of that, and I also see a bit of it in our community.
Yeah, and I would agree. Not strictly from the clinical side of it, but just the personal side of just, yeah, I feel like I'm pretty dug into the things that I feel are important and the things that I value. And I hear you when you're saying, I'm kind of laughing when you're like kind of being annoying about it. Like I think I was writing about that in the book that I'm writing about, like post discovery or diagnosis, like wanting to scream it from the rooftops and just consistently like and constantly talk about and then apply autistic experience and lens to everything and every conversation and everything you do, and how people around you could possibly be like, can we talk about anything else, like without having to loop this in or this be the specific focal point. So I can see how that can be annoying. If any of my friends are listening that sometimes are annoyed, then, I apologize, but it's like a sorry, not sorry experience, because like, I think it's so important to talk about this stuff and talk about it a lot and with passion and with curiosity, because I think for so long, so many of us have felt like we didn't have an outlet. We didn't have a safe place to do it. We didn't have the resources or the education or the knowledge. I was just talking to someone on my podcast, on my other podcast, about like, I don't even think the word autism or ADHD was mentioned in my grad school program. I think it was mentioned if we did like child development, and that was like one class. And it was probably like looking at it from a very medical deficit based model. So I do think for me, one value is like using my voice and my privilege and my platform to share my passion and my message, and to support people to feel more understood and affirmed and seen and validated. And that is really fucking important to me. So I don't know. I just understand the annoyance piece too. Like I can see it in people's eyes sometimes when I'm talking about something. They're just like, this isn't even on the topic. This isn't even what we're talking about.
I actually think this loops back into our earlier conversation about like like leaning into the misfitness of ourselves. Of I think especially I would assume for all three of us, we spent so much energy and time trying to fit into the path that we thought we were supposed to, trying to fit into the norms, kind of suppressing probably our instinct to dig our heels in and talk a lot about whatever we were interested in. So I think this goes with like when we come out of the closet and then we come out of the many closets and then it's like, oh wait, I am going to talk about this thing that I'm really passionate about. I think that's part of the kind of liberating experience of unmasking, of discovering who we are. Part of that becomes also becoming more vocal about our interests. And because I see a lot of interest shame, like a lot of where people will have a lot of shame about their interests. They're kind of embarrassed about how passionate they are about it because they at some point have learned like, oh, this is too much. And so some people who will be very protective about talking about their interests, both because I think they're protecting it from negative feedback from others, but also just because people can develop shame around how passionate they are about whatever it is they're interested in.
You bringing up misfitness, and it's making me think of a couple things. One is that I've always been really scared to be othered because I never fit in. I always was trying to fit in. But ever since I was in high school, I've had colorful hair. I have a lot of facial piercings, lots of tattoos. I present in a way, especially as a business owner, in what wouldn't be a typical way. And I am thinking about how, like 5 or so years ago, Natalie Edmond, she was my anti-racism coach, my individual one. She consults with my group practice for the past few years. But maybe 5 or so years ago, she had said, was talking about privilege of like other people knowing or not knowing things about us. Like a Black person can't not be seen as Black, right? But at the time I was bi and I was married to a man, I had the privilege of looking straight. And I was thinking about how I did a lot of things that, like presentation wise, to like almost tell people things without actually saying things. And it wasn't until last year where I became vocal about being a lesbian, about being autistic and ADHD, which was not something that was in my comfort zone, because for me, it's been a historical thing of, if you give information about yourself that is other or different, it's just ammunition for kids to use against you later. And I don't know, the thing with Natalie saying like that's a privilege to be able to not share those things was something that like sparked some kind of fire from the social justice lens of like, wow, that is in a lot of ways unfair, and is kind of my duty to like not hide those things. And I noticed that once I, was vocal about my sexuality, and being ADHD at the time before getting the autistic diagnosis, and starting to share that in work, like as a leader in my group practice. We made these identity cards that our new staff continue to make, that they can share whatever identities they want to share. And I remember that being kind of like the pivotal moment of where like acceptance and inclusivity like truly started happening in my business, because we were always talking about it. But like, I think there was something about me not sharing myself in that way that probably was modeling shit, all the way down. And so it's been a really long journey that I know, Patrick, a little bit about, of just like looking into every single policy and procedure we have, every single verbal and nonverbal thing that we do that is either like providing accessibility or not. I don't know. So this like misfitness, I know maybe goes in a whole circle right now, but is me trying to explain, I felt I think I was exploring my misfitness in a nonverbal way for a really long time. And it wasn't until my anti-racism coach, Natalie, was like, that's a privilege that you can present in ways that don't show, the fact that your sexuality, or that don't show, your neurodivergence and things like that, where others don't have that ability.
That's so interesting. I've never thought about this before until hearing you talk about that. But I absolutely did that too. Like I actually just took out my nose piercing a year or two ago, but like when I was younger, I had a nose piercing. I had so many ear piercings. I had a trachea piercing. I had a tongue piercing. I wore leather. I presented myself, both kind of, I think I presented myself with a hard edge because I'm so soft that it was, for one, that was protective, but also I didn't have language for my misfitness, but I wanted to present it to the world. And for me, as I've become more like out about being autistic, gender expansive, all of those things, I have softened. Like I soften in how I present, in the sense of I'm pretty basic. I wear soft clothes. I don't have any piercings anymore, but I think there's less pressure to kind of visually show that, as I've more explicitly been sharing my identities. But I hadn't made that connection before about how we might visually be trying to communicate something that we don't yet have language for. Um, yeah, but also like the whole conversation around intersecting identities and the ones that are visible versus invisible. And like, I think that's such an important part of the intersectional conversation that doesn't get talked about enough, especially in a lot of autism spaces, where it's like, what identities is that autism intersecting with? So I love that your coach kind of brought awareness to that aspect of privilege.
Just thinking about like what you're both saying, and like I think maybe it's just because the exact opposite experience is like a young white boy who was really sensitive. I muted myself all the time. Like I never tried to stand out. I never tried to send a message. I tried to like disappear from it all and be in the background at all costs. And I think I've talked about this with you, Megan, like constantly was wearing like blue, black, gray, never colorful, never would have like all of these watercolored bright tattoos all over my body. Never would send the message like I'm wearing a shirt that says more of a Roy than a Ted. But that's the reality for me. Like I never would have given myself permission to explicitly show any part of my personality. I muted it at all costs. So I had the exact opposite experience in a way of like post discovery and diagnosis. I was like, I can fucking be myself. Like, oh my God. It was like, I can wear brighter clothing. I can like wear clothing that fits my body instead of like.
Only if Ariel approves that the shoes match the top.
Yeah, that's fair. Shout out to my wife for ensuring I never look like, what she would say is like, you look like you walked out of the house like nobody loves you, is what she would say. And I'll be like, Jesus.
I love Ariel.
Yeah.
So this is where I think gender plays a part of it, and maybe not, and I think this maybe came up in a conversation we had previously. I think by me, and I'll be curious your thoughts on this, Maureen, by me presenting a like hard, kind of edgy vibe, like I was trying to tell the world, give me space,
Yes.
which is not what the world does to girls.
Nope.
And so that was me muting myself, was me putting on this like, don't F with me.
I was literally thinking as you're talking the same thing, because I was like, I was a wallflower in a lot of ways. I did not want people to talk to me. But it was more of a like trying to give myself this look of like, leave me alone. I was thinking of The Breakfast Club. Have you guys seen that? I don't remember what my daughter, my younger one, and I recently watched it, and she loves it. We're on a kick of watching like old like 80s, 90s movies, and I'm surprised at how much she's like into them. But you know that one girl who's like pretty much quiet the whole time, but she's got like the dark hair and the like, that's like kind of how I feel like my presentation was. Like, it definitely was a just, leave her alone, and it was almost like I was a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of ways. Like, I actually wanted to be like a part of something and embraced and like felt like, people liked me. But because I wasn't, I would present in ways that almost would keep that continuing, but also would create then this place where people had like ammunition to use against me in that way.
It's such a good psychological defense, right? It's like, I'm going to reject you before you can reject me. Same thing like in college. And partly I did love reading. But I would always bring a book to the cafeteria because it'd be so awkward to be like, to figure out like, what table am I going to sit at? So it's like, I'm going to go choose to sit alone and read a book. And I think it made me, I actually think this is why boys wanted to date me in college, because I think it made me seem like this like elusive, kind of mysterious person for someone who is trying to break in, but failing to do so. And so that, yeah, I think we had very similar like defenses going through life of, let me reject you before you reject me, but also let me make it look like I don't care about being aloof, like I don't care about being disconnected.
Yep.
Yeah, I would imagine that it was exactly what it was. And I think people often are drawn to like what they want but can't have mentality. I always ask people about, like, especially at my retreats and summits, like, people are really drawn to me, but I don't want to be around them. Maureen can attest to that. Like, she and I will often like jet off to hide somewhere else with like a smaller group of 4 people. And people want access to me because I think they can't get it. And it's really fascinating. I'm like, why are people so drawn to me if like I'm constantly removing myself from the environment?
I don't know. I have no idea. Yes, because I'm so because nobody comes up to me. And we know similar people because of the work we do, but you are correct. And people gravitate towards you so much. And I have been told that like I'm just like, someone that looks like they don't want to be approached, and also I've said before, like, I feel like I'm in work sometimes like this vessel of, take information. I'm not this like actual being. I'm, here to like give you business advice. And I get that I like started it by how I chose to like support business owners. And now it's, 12 years into it. I think maybe I'm projecting, but like, I feel like I'm just like more like a being who's not human, who people are like, they know this person knows how to run a business. I'm going to take information from them, but I don't see them as like a person to connect with almost, which is so interesting because you're the same way, or not the same way, but you're like, I don't need to talk to people, but somehow people don't see it and they're like, I need to talk to you.
Like, I'm so intrigued by this. I'm curious, Maureen, do you think there's something part of this, like, don't F with me vibe, but like, do you think there's some energy you're putting off? Because what you're describing sounds very transactional. Like, people are coming to me for like transactional engagements. Like, do you think there's some kind of energy you're putting off of like, that's what I'm open to, versus partly because of this, like, the wallflower, don't mess with me? Or do you think that's just people have blocked you in mind?
I feel like I mean, one of the reasons I started my own group practice was because whenever I was employed, I'm like an overachiever. That's just me. And I remember, and I'm making my own stories because no one ever would tell me why, but like, I was never fully utilized ever. Like, I would get shit done fast and I'd be like, is there anything you'd like me to do? Anything more? No, you just want me to sit now because I did all this. I never was asked to be in any leadership positions. I remember having like higher degrees than some people in like hospital settings when I was in, right after undergrad, where other people who didn't would just get like higher positions. And it wasn't because I wasn't working. And I remember saying, I want to be my own boss. Because I always was just like, I think it's because I look different. I think it's because I'm quiet. I am introverted. I don't hang out after work with the people and go for drinks, which probably is helpful in upward mobility and all this stuff. And so I was like, I'm gonna start my own business because I don't need other people. Like I was the person when I was in school that if there was an odd number of people, I was like, I'll be the one that doesn't do a group project. I'll do it myself. Like couple up everyone. And I would like be counting the people to see like, oh my God, is there an even amount? Because I don't want to have to be with someone. And so I think I started my group practice, my first business, being like, fuck everyone. I don't need anyone. I can run a business all on my own. And I can be successful by myself, and I can choose how I want to work, and I can push myself as much as I want to. And I think, yes, I probably started that transactional, like, of course you aren't going to want me for any emotional reason or any like other sort of reason other than for you to get what you want. So as I hired people, I was like, I'm here so that you can have a job, so that you can be able to live whatever life that you want to have. I'm here to like provide you with whatever you need so that you can live your life. But I remember vividly thinking maybe 6 or 7 years ago that like I almost put myself in a position of being separated from people by being a business owner, right? Because you can't have the same kind of relationship that peers and like employees have as a business owner, right? And so I almost think I did that on purpose in some ways. I don't think without realizing it.
Oh my gosh. Is it okay if I jump in?
Totally.
So I have said the same thing. I actually haven't thought about it because I feel like I treat my employees as friends, which maybe I shouldn't. But so when I was going through my doctoral program, it's a cohort-based program. Typically you get pretty close to your cohort. And there were a couple of people that I developed good relationships with. But I noticed in my second year, I started TAing, and I was like, all of the things I was doing socially was mentorship. Like I am so much more comfortable when I'm a mentor, when I'm the one. It is, part of the assessment for autism, right, is like kind of non-reciprocal.
Yep.
Which there's issues with that. But I did find my workaround for non-reciprocal was to always have asymmetrical relationships where I was either like I'm the therapist or I'm the mentor, like where I'm pouring into the other. And that is one of the ways I've adapted from both the emotional discomfort of true reciprocal relationships, but also the pragmatics of like, you talk, then I talk. And then,
Yeah.
so yeah, I absolutely, man, we share a lot of similar like adaptations to our autistic brain and how we've moved through the world.
I was thinking that I've had the last two guests on, you and Unetta, on for a reason, and I knew Megan was going to connect with their stories, so really happy to feel victorious in this. Like, yes. I want to say something because what you said is really important to me as a friend. You said people treat me as a vessel. Most people in the mental health entrepreneurial space know you as the owner of the group practice exchange. You have a membership with a lot of members. I don't even know the number. I know it brings in a lot of money because we've talked about it, and it does really well because it's a really good resource. Your group practice has upwards of 70, 80 employees, like multiple locations. You have a book about leadership. Here's the thing that I want to point out. When you spoke in Alaska at the conference we were at, it was a personal story and it was a personal speaker presentation. And I think that was, you mentioned your first opportunity, albeit very uncomfortable for you, to share who you were like as a human, opposed to like this face of like this thing that you have created. And I just think that was like the indication for me of exactly what you just said, of like people treat me as this resource, as this vessel, as this like community connector who has all the insight. And this was a very different experience for you to speak in that regard. And I want to give you a lot of credit because I know it was really uncomfortable for you too.
Yeah, I will never do that again.
That's my point. That's my point, is what I'm saying is like,
I did not feel like an expert at all.
so when we're talking about,
Maureen, are you an Enneagram 3?
Yes.
Okay. I was like, there's just too much similarity. Are you an Enneagram 3 wing 4?
Wing 5, I think. Is that the,
okay.
which one's 5?
5 is like ideation. 4 is like kind of a melancholy soul, and like no one's ever gonna fully know me.
Hold on.
But
We'll
when they
have to
do,
look
I
this
get
up.
really
Processing,
attached.
very analytical, deep processing. A lot of
Yeah,
artists. are
5.
full-
Yeah, 5 is very ideation. I have a lot of 5 aspects too. Very like you move through the world through like your mind. Like
I'm a
that kind
3-8. Sorry, not a 3-5. I'm a type. I have
Oh.
mine on here. I just looked up.
Yeah.
So I'm an Enneagram 3. Second highest was an 8, and then my third highest was a tie between a 6, 9, and 4.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know what
Makes
that all means. All I know is 3, and I'm like, oh, that makes sense. I'm the achiever.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear that.
I just want to
Okay.
point out though that the sheer irony of you saying like people treat me as a vessel, but I will never do this thing where I give more of myself away and be more vulnerable. So like there's that.
I know.
I'm gonna continue to push you on that.
I mean, well, we create, that's part of it, right? Like and not completely, but like we contribute to the enactments that we repeat. So part
For
of
sure.
it is other people, like right now, all 3 of our conscious minds are contributing to this conversation. All 3 of our unconscious minds are contributing to this dynamic. And so, yes, we're always part of the enactments and the patterns that we recreate. And I'm very similar to you, Maureen. Like that's partly why I started this podcast. I was like, I want to hide behind my infographics and education and not talk about, like, someone invited me a year or 2 ago, and partly it was not enough structure, but it was like, come talk about autism and your experience. And first I was like, that's way too vague. And 2, I was like, are you sure you don't want me to talk about like misdiagnosis or
Yeah.
like education? Because I can do
Yep.
that. But
Yeah. No, that's exactly how I feel.
Well, with that being said, I want to just name that. Like there's a vulnerability in that. There's a vulnerability in putting ourselves out there and talking more about who we are and our own stories, our own journeys, especially as business owners, as leaders, as thought leaders in general. Like there's always going to be that vulnerability. So even if you never do it again, I give you a lot of credit for doing it one time.
Yeah.
And
I mean, maybe I'll share more about myself in a way that isn't only about one topic.
yeah,
was it about autism?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A way that like embraces multiplicity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. And I think what you're also saying is like you're sick of being typecast as this specific like one track individual who just talks about leadership.
Right. Right.
But then there's like, this is where I feel comfortable talking about leadership.
It is.
I think also finding the medium, like giving a big presentation where the feedback loop is like, there's not as much of a feedback loop because you're talking and yes, you're seeing people's faces versus a conversation like we're having now. Like I experience you as very personable in this conversation we're having right now. And so I also think for folks like us for whom I think we can have a lot of like intellectual defenses before you get vulnerable, finding the medium. Like, I don't think I could be as personable and vulnerable as I am on this podcast if I was giving a presentation or like in different mediums. It has to be happening in the context of a conversation for me.
Yeah.
Which
agree
took
with
me a
that.
while to figure out.
I do tend to do better in like small group or one-on-one supporting of people. And I find that like it is less transactional in those ways.
Yeah.
But the like, you know, anything that's like many people to one, I always feel like that's where I just become more transactional. And so, yeah, I don't know, Patrick, back to your point of you, like people come to you.
I don't want them to.
Yes, I'm like
You need
surprised.
more black, you need more piercings. Like we can help you. We can help you come up with a vibe.
Soda has a few fake nose rings. Now that they have a real one, I can always bring one next time for you.
Back in junior high, I had like the Jenko jeans, and I was like, but I also then would pair it with like Nike or Adidas shirts for soccer, and I had frosted tips. I really didn't know who I was. It was very confusing for me. I'm trying to bring it back. Ariel is not a fan. She's like, no, that can't happen in this house. Yeah, it's a weird phenomenon. Like people do want a lot of access to me and I'm not going to give it to them. And I think it's this push pull of like, can we get closer? How do we buy access? By coming on more events, coming on more retreats. Like it's never going to phase me. I need to build authentic, real relationships. Otherwise, a lot of the conversations are going to be like pretty short and direct and to the point and a lot of awkward ways of getting out of them, as well as the retreat host, where you just start backing out of conversations that people who have paid you to have. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. I haven't figured out the medium there
It
yet.
might also be like gender related. Our industry tends to be a lot of women, and like a man who's, a little less like, giving of their energy and space and time might just be a trick. Because I know I get much more, I feel like I'm a really kind person. Like, despite how I might look, I'm not a gossip. I'm not like, I don't talk meanly about people. Even when people like friends are like, yeah, that person, right? And I'm like, well, like, not my favorite, but like, that's as far as I'm very like generally nice, and I never get angry. And so like, but I know that any amount of, if I don't give, like I get people who are really angry and judging. And I always, I don't know, just kind of assumed it played into like, I'm a woman and there's an expectation to be like giving. And maybe you have less of it as a dude. I don't know.
Perhaps.
Maybe.
There's actually research on this, especially in like the academy. It's interesting because in tenure, so tenure is kind of the means you've made it if you're a professor. And men typically have a much easier time getting it for a few reasons. But there's been some research that looks at the invisible labor of female professors and professors of color. And because a lot of the things, like in general, students will come for mentorship to female professors more, or professors of color, like students of color will gravitate towards them. So there's a lot of emotional labor. And then there's also a lot more coordinating, like a lot of the social stuff, things that professors aren't given tenure for. A lot of those, what might be called like those softer, more people-y things. And so it's been talked about as the invisible labor that is done. And I think, right, that's research specific to academia, but I think that could be applied to a lot of different work contexts. That in general, I think that there's a lot of invisible labor that gets put on various identities.
I agree.
Very true. Very true. So I want to be mindful of time. We've been talking for almost an hour. We've diverged all over the
We've
damn
diverged a bit.
Sorry, guys.
And actually, it was just like a minute ago when Patrick was talking about your business. I was like, oh, whoa, I didn't realize. I knew you ran the membership. I didn't realize your clinical practice was 70 employees. That's a huge team.
Yeah, no, I think it's a little less than that. I think we're in the 60s. Yeah.
That's still a huge team. I can't even wrap my mind around the executive functioning involved in managing that.
It's called I bring a leadership team on so that I can stay sane.
So that's why. That's
we
brilliant.
Didn't talk about leadership. We didn't talk about delegation. We didn't talk about accountability. So yeah.
I mean, we didn't treat Maureen like a vessel.
Yeah, we did like a vessel.
Yeah, you didn't.
I'd say this is the most divergent, successful ending to a series but I enjoyed getting to get beneath the surface about all of it too. I will say this, and this is just a shameless plug for Maureen because she's not going to do it for herself. I've watched her speak on accountability and leadership and delegation and creating accessibility. And you are a wizard. You were the only person that I listened to in our Greece retreat where I was like, wow, I could listen to this all day. So I just want to shout that out. Like it's truly amazing what you have created. And a lot of our listeners are going to have no fucking clue because
let's bring it conversational. So I've just hired my first full-time employee. I have historically worked with contractors, but I am now like have a legit team. So I'm thinking about these things. I'm thinking about accountability. I'm thinking about like, how do I want to structure my business in a way, like I'm starting to put a lot of thought into this. So I'm curious, what you do around delegation and accountability, is this specific to mental health entrepreneurs or is this for all entrepreneurs?
I've written the book specific to mental health, to group practice. But I have a lot of friends who own businesses in other areas, and the concepts are, universal. It's just that my stories that like bring the ideas to life, I use group practices as the storyline for it.
That
Yeah.
makes sense. That makes sense. So those
Yeah.
that was anchor because that's your context, but these are ideas that could be translatable to. Cool.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, essentially it's about creating like a leadership team that is accountable so that it trickles down to like the business and team at large. So like what are the core roles that are in most businesses, from finance and HR and admin operations, clinical operations for us in our industry, sales and marketing, and then like how do you create roles and functions that then the team can set accountabilities through? Because a lot of times we just have titles with some job expectations, and then if you ever look at an offer letter with a job description, a lot of times half of the things aren't actually being done, and people are usually surprised and are like, oh my God, I didn't realize this was actually on my job description. And it's like, oh, because the through line wasn't there. Your role and your the functions within your role weren't clearly laid out for you to actually stay accountable to them.
This is why I feel like when autistic processing like build systems, the systems often can like because the implicit is made explicit. And so I think a lot of times the communication and the process can be streamlined because there's a lot of that, just that autistic processing that goes into building systems. That sounds really cool.
Just to piggyback on all this, my wife sat in on your talk and took like vigorous notes, and she works for the federal government and was like, she's in leadership. She's like, we could use all of this. Maureen needs to adapt this to be universal. So I just want to say, like,
Thanks.
that's how she came home with it. I told her to order your book. She said she's not going to do that. She's like, I'll just get it from you and like steal all this.
I feel like I left a bajillion copies in Alaska. You should have just stolen one.
I have it. You sent it to me for your book launch, but
that's right. That's right.
She was seriously like trying to implement some of your ideas into the sector of the government that she works for. So I just want to say they can be used and applicable all over the place and universally, not just to mental health providers specifically. Okay, we are at that time. So great conversation. We are wrapping up our neurodivergent entrepreneurial series today. Lots of great interviews, different perspectives, different neurotypes, different experiences. The next segue is that Megan and I are going to start recording a OCD series, and we have a lot of good guests lined up for that. So, Maureen, tell the audience where they can find you, and then we will close this out.
Yep. My website, 𝗲𝗃practiceexchange.com, or I'm on Instagram. My business is also on Facebook, but I'm not as active in there. It's at the Group Practice Exchange.
Perfect. And we'll have that information in the show notes, as well as a link to her book, The Accountability Equation, which you did not mention, and you said you were not going to. So I guess you stayed true to your word. And new episodes of Divergent Conversations are out on Fridays on all major platforms and YouTube. Like, download, subscribe, share, and we will see you next week.